The Notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, a sleepy summary. Somewhere in the soft and drifting hours between evening and night, when the light has gone amber and the world outside has grown very still, it is pleasant to imagine a man sitting at a wide wooden table covered entirely in papers. The papers are everywhere, stacked in uneven towers, spread flat and pinned at the corners with small smooth stones, folded into quarters and stuffed into the pockets of a long robe, or simply loose and drifting very gently whenever the door is opened and a breath of cool Florentine air moves through the room. The man at the table is writing with his left hand, moving from right to left across the page in the way that left-handed people sometimes find more natural, so that the words, if you tried to read them in the ordinary way, would appear as a beautiful and mysterious tangle of reversed letters. His name is Leonardo, and he has been writing in these notebooks, on and off, for most of his adult life. He writes about everything. That is the first, and perhaps the most important thing to understand about these notebooks, and it is a thing that can be held very gently in the mind as you let your own thoughts begin to slow and soften at the edges. Leonardo does not write about one subject, or two subjects, or even 10 subjects. He writes about the way water moves when it flows around a stone. He writes about the bones inside a human foot and how they fit together like a small and elegant puzzle. He writes about the properties of light when it strikes a curved surface, and about the way shadows fall differently in the morning than they do in the afternoon, and about the best recipes for mixing certain pigments with oil so that the colors in a painting will remain bright and clear for centuries after the painter himself has gone. He writes about birds and horses and the anatomy of the tongue. He writes about mathematics and music and the patterns that appear in the growth of plants. He writes in one famous passage about a childhood memory of a kite, a large bird, not a toy, that he believed had flown down and touched his face when he was a baby in his cradle, and how that memory, or perhaps that dream, had stayed with him always and fed in some deep and quiet way his lifelong fascination with flight. The notebooks exist today in fragments, scattered across the great libraries and collections of Europe, and what we have of them represents only a portion of what Leonardo actually wrote. Scholars believe he may have produced as many as 13,000 pages of notes and drawings during his lifetime, of which roughly 7,000 have survived. Reading them, even in translation, even with all the gaps and the missing sections and the passages that remain stubbornly obscure, is one of the strangest and most quietly wonderful experiences that books can offer. It is a little like being allowed to sit very close to a mind that is always in motion, always noticing, always asking the next question, and yet it is also, strangely, a very restful experience, because the mind you are sitting close to is so genuinely delighted by everything it encounters that its delight becomes contagious, and you find yourself relaxing into curiosity rather than effort. Let us begin at the beginning, or at least at one possible beginning, which is with water. Leonardo was obsessed with water in the way that certain people are obsessed with particular things, not anxiously, not compulsively, but with a deep and abiding and apparently inexhaustible interest that kept returning to the same subject from new angles, year after year, finding always something new to notice or to wonder about. He studied water with the same attention he gave to everything else, which is to say, with his eyes wide open and his pen ready, sitting beside rivers and channels and fountains, and letting the movement of the water teach him things that he then tried to capture in words and drawings. He noticed that water, when it flows, creates patterns. Not random patterns, not chaos, but specific and repeating forms, spirals, eddies, the long smooth curves of laminar flow, the sudden turbulent froth where a current strikes an obstacle. He drew these patterns with extraordinary care, page after page of water studies, trying to find in the visible surface behavior of rivers some deeper principle about the nature of motion itself. He believed, and he was largely right, that understanding how water moves was a key to understanding how many other things move: air, smoke, the flow of blood in veins and arteries, even the movement of light through space. Everything, to Leonardo, was connected, and water was one of the great connective tissues, one of the subjects through which many other subjects could be approached. He also had extremely practical reasons for studying water, because much of his professional life involved engineering projects related to the control and direction of waterways. He worked on canal systems, on the drainage of marshes, on the design of locks and weirs, and the management of river flooding. He made detailed plans for diverting whole rivers, including an ambitious scheme to divert the Arno so as to give Florence a navigable waterway to the sea, bypassing the city of Pisa. The plan was never carried out, but the notebooks contain page after page of careful calculations and drawings relating to it, showing a mind that could move easily between the abstract beauty of water patterns and the very concrete business of moving large volumes of earth and water from one place to another. There is something soothing about reading Leonardo on water. His prose in these passages has a kind of flow to it that mirrors its subject, a patient, observational, moving from one detail to the next with an unhurried curiosity. He describes the way a river undercuts its outer bank on a curve, the way water rises in a spiral when it flows through a narrow passage, the way a stone thrown into still water creates rings that expand outward in perfect circles, each ring moving at the same speed as all the others. These are things you can close your eyes and picture very easily, letting the images form softly behind your eyelids as you settle deeper into your pillow. From water, Leonardo moves naturally to air, because for him they were always connected, both fluids, both capable of the same beautiful patterns of flow, both subjects that had to be understood if he was ever going to achieve the thing he wanted most, which was to build a machine that could fly. The flying machine sections of the notebooks are among the most famous, and they are worth dwelling on for a moment because they illustrate something important about how Leonardo's mind worked. He did not simply sit down one day and sketch a flying machine. He spent years, perhaps decades, studying birds. He watched them from hillsides and from the windows of his studio. He obtained dead specimens and dissected their wings, carefully noting the arrangement of the bones and the way the feathers attached and the mechanism by which a bird could change the curve of its wing to generate more or less lift. He filled notebooks with these observations, building up slowly and carefully a body of knowledge about bird flight that was, for its time, extraordinarily sophisticated. He understood that a bird's wing does not simply push against the air the way an oar pushes against water. He understood that the curved upper surface of a wing causes air to flow faster over the top than the bottom, creating a pressure difference that generates lift, a principle that would not be formally described in physics for another 3 centuries. He understood that birds use subtle adjustments of their wing shape and their tail to control their direction and stability in flight, and that these adjustments happen very rapidly and in response to constant moment-by-moment changes in the air around them. He understood, in short, a great deal about the aerodynamics of bird flight, and he tried to incorporate this understanding into his designs for flying machines. The designs themselves are extraordinary to look at, elegant, intricate, and deeply human in their ambition. There are ornithopters, machines with flapping wings operated by the pilot's arms and legs. There are glider designs that look, in some ways, surprisingly like modern hang gliders. There is a device that appears to be a forerunner of the helicopter, a screw-shaped rotor that Leonardo believed would compress the air beneath it and rise upward as it spun. There is even a small parachute design, a conical canopy that Leonardo calculated would allow a person to descend safely from any height. Most of these designs would not have worked, for reasons having to do with the power-to-weight ratio of human muscles and the structural limitations of the materials available to Leonardo. But they are not fantasies, not arbitrary imaginings. They are serious engineering proposals based on serious scientific observation. And reading them, you can feel the genuine longing that powered them, the desire to leave the ground and move through the air the way birds do, freely and easily, with the whole world spread out below. The human body is another great subject of the notebooks, and here Leonardo's genius expresses itself perhaps most clearly, because the anatomical studies he produced during his lifetime were not equaled for accuracy and beauty for more than a century after his death. He conducted dissections, perhaps as many as 30 complete human bodies, a remarkable number for the time, when anatomical dissection was heavily restricted by both law and religious custom. And from these dissections, he made drawings that remain among the most beautiful and illuminating anatomical illustrations ever produced. He drew the skull from multiple angles, showing the cavities inside it and the passages through which nerves and blood vessels traveled. He drew the vertebral column and its articulations, the way the individual vertebrae fit together with their cushioning discs of cartilage, the way the whole column curves gently from side to side and front to back to absorb the shocks of movement. He drew the arm in extraordinary detail, showing the layered muscles and how they attached to the bones, how the tendons ran from the muscles down through the wrist to move the individual fingers. He drew the hand, that most complex and capable of human instruments, over and over, from every angle in every position, with the muscles and tendons visible beneath the skin or the skin laid flat and the deeper structures exposed. He was particularly fascinated by the heart. He understood long before the formal discovery of the circulatory system, that the heart was a pump and that it moved blood through the body by means of a rhythmic contraction. He studied the valves of the heart with extraordinary care, making careful wax injections to understand their three-dimensional shape, and he described their action with a clarity and accuracy that would not be matched for a very long time. He even had a theory about the spiral flow of blood within the heart chambers, a theory that has been partially vindicated by modern imaging technology, which shows that blood does indeed move through the heart in complex spiraling patterns. And yet there is something in the way Leonardo writes about the body that goes beyond the merely scientific. He writes with a kind of reverence, a sense of wonder at the ingenuity of the natural design, a feeling that in studying the human body, he is reading a text written by the most skilled engineer who ever existed. He writes in one of the most famous passages in the notebooks that the human foot is a masterpiece of engineering and a work of art, and reading this in bed, with your feet tucked under the covers, it is pleasant to turn this thought over gently, to consider the bones and tendons and small muscles of your own feet, all working together so quietly and automatically that you never think about them. The whole elegant machinery of balance and motion that carries you through your days without asking for any conscious attention at all. Leonardo thought a great deal about light and shadow, and this is another place where the notebooks are particularly rich and where the reading is particularly pleasant, because the subject itself is peaceful, light moving across surfaces, shadows pooling in corners and under eyelids, the quality of illumination changing through the day from the blue coolness of morning to the warm gold of afternoon to the long horizontal red of evening. He was the first person to describe clearly and systematically the distinction between the umbra and the penumbra, between the fully shadowed region where no light from the source can reach, and the partially shadowed region at the edge where some light gets through. This distinction, which seems obvious once you know it, was not obvious before Leonardo described it, and the clarity of his description helped lay the groundwork for everything that would later be understood about optics and the geometry of light. He wrote about the way light behaves differently depending on the nature of the surface it strikes. A polished metal surface reflects light in a single concentrated beam. A rough stone surface scatters it in many directions. A translucent material like alabaster or thin skin allows light to pass through it partly, creating that warm, soft glow, what Leonardo called luster, that you see at the edge of a candle flame or through a human ear held up against a bright window. He was trying to understand these phenomena not merely as a scientist, but as a painter, because as a painter he needed to know how to represent them on a flat canvas, how to use the limited vocabulary of pigment and oil to suggest the infinite complexity of the way light moves in the actual world. His theory of painting, which runs through many sections of the notebooks, is based on this deep study of light. He believed that the painter's primary job was to understand light, to know, for every surface in the scene being represented, exactly where the light was coming from, what angle it struck the surface at, what color and quality it had, and how the surface reflected or absorbed or scattered it. Get the light right, Leonardo believed, and everything else in a painting would follow naturally. The forms would appear three-dimensional, the materials would seem to have their proper textures and weights, the faces would seem alive with inner feeling. Because what we see when we look at a person's face is always, in the end, light moving across surfaces. And if the painter has observed and understood and reproduced this movement correctly, the illusion of life is complete. There are quieter passages in the notebooks too, passages that read almost like personal meditations, and these are in some ways the most moving of all, because they remind you that behind all the science and the engineering and the art theory there was a person who got tired, who doubted himself, who was aware that time was passing and that he was not finishing all the things he had started. Leonardo was famously, notoriously, unable to finish things. The list of his incomplete works is almost as impressive as the list of his completed ones. The great equestrian statue he was commissioned to make for Ludovico Sforza in Milan, a bronze horse that was to be the largest ever cast, an enormous and magnificent thing, was never made. The clay model he built for it, which contemporary accounts describe as breathtaking, was used as target practice by French soldiers during the invasion of Milan in 1499 and was destroyed. The Battle of Anghiari, the enormous mural he was commissioned to paint in the Council Hall of Florence, was abandoned before it was complete, and the portion he did paint was destroyed by subsequent renovation. Even The Last Supper, his most famous surviving work, was executed in an experimental technique that began to deteriorate almost immediately after it was finished, so that within Leonardo's own lifetime it was already fading. He writes about this incompleteness in the notebooks, sometimes in a tone that reads as anxious, sometimes in a tone that reads as accepting, sometimes in a tone that reads as simply puzzled, as if he cannot quite understand why his hands and his time cannot keep up with his mind. He writes lists of things he needs to do, things he needs to learn, things he needs to find out or verify. He writes reminders to himself: obtain the skull of a certain man, ask such and such a scholar about a particular problem in mathematics, return to the study of the tongue. The lists are long and always growing, and you get the sense reading them that Leonardo's mind was always generating new questions faster than he could answer the old ones. That curiosity was both his greatest gift and, in some practical sense, his greatest difficulty. There is a passage in the notebooks. Scholars have debated its exact meaning, but its emotional tone is clear, in which Leonardo writes about the sorrow of a life spent beginning things and not finishing them. He does not dwell on this sorrow. He is not a self-pitying writer. But the acknowledgement of it is there, quiet and honest, and it gives the notebooks a human weight that the purely scientific and technical passages, for all their brilliance, do not quite have on their own. Let us rest for a moment in the geology sections, which are among the most quietly beautiful in the entire collection of notebooks, and which have the particular quality of making the world feel very old and very calm, the way that geological thinking always does, the way it places the brief flicker of a human life against the vast and patient timescales of rock and sediment and the slow movement of continents. Leonardo was fascinated by fossils. He found them in the hillsides of Tuscany and in the rocks near Milan, and he thought about them with a seriousness and an intelligence that was, for his time, quite unusual. Most educated people in the 15th and early 16th centuries believed that fossils were either the work of God, placed in the rock as a test of faith, or as a kind of ornamental decoration of the natural world, or the residue of Noah's flood, sea creatures that had been swept inland by the Great Deluge and then buried in the sediment as the waters receded. Leonardo thought neither of these explanations was adequate, and he said so in the notebooks with characteristic directness. He argued carefully and systematically that the only explanation for fossils that made sense was that the rocks in which they were found had once been at the bottom of the sea. The shellfish and fish and other sea creatures whose remains were preserved in the rock had lived and died there, at the bottom of an ancient ocean, and had slowly been covered by layers of sediment that compacted and hardened over very long periods of time into the stone in which they were now found. And the reason those rocks were now in hillsides and mountains, hundreds of feet above sea level, was not that the sea had briefly risen to cover them and then receded. That would not have left them in the positions they were found in, stacked in orderly layers like pages in a book, but that the land itself had slowly risen over immense stretches of time, lifting the former seafloor up and up until it became the mountain ranges that were now visible. This is essentially correct. It is a genuinely remarkable piece of geological reasoning for a man who was born in 1452 and was working without any of the theoretical framework that would later make such reasoning routine. Leonardo arrived at it purely by observation and logic, by looking at fossils and rocks and asking the question that always drove him. Not what does received wisdom say about this, but what do the things themselves show you when you look at them carefully and honestly. There is something deeply restful about this kind of thinking when you let it wash over you in the quiet of the evening. The world was once beneath an ocean. The mountains are the former seafloor, risen slowly over millions of years. The fossils in the rock are the remains of creatures who swam in that ancient water, creatures who are now stone, perfectly preserved in their stone beds, the shapes of their shells and bones still sharp and clear, as if they had only just been pressed into wet clay. Everything is much older and much slower than it seems. The hills outside the window have been in motion for longer than the mind can comfortably grasp, and they are still in motion, rising or sinking by fractions of millimeters each year, obeying the same slow rhythms they have obeyed for as long as there has been a world at all. The notebooks contain extensive passages on mathematics, and these are worth pausing on briefly, not because mathematics is a soporific subject, it can be, but it does not need to be, but because Leonardo's relationship with mathematics was unusual and reveals something important about how he thought. He was not, by the standards of professional mathematicians of his day, a particularly advanced mathematician. He struggled with certain kinds of calculation, and he knew it. The notebooks contain many rueful acknowledgments of mathematical difficulties, many passages where he has clearly gotten confused and has to backtrack and start again. But he had a profound intuition for the mathematical structure underlying natural phenomena, and he could see patterns and proportions and relationships in the physical world with an acuity that more formally trained mathematicians often lacked. He was fascinated by the work of Luca Pacioli, a friar and mathematician who was one of the foremost mathematical minds of the Italian Renaissance, and who became Leonardo's close friend and collaborator during the years Leonardo spent in Milan. Pacioli's great work was on proportion, on the mathematical ratios that appeared throughout nature and art, in the proportions of the human body, in the geometry of crystals and plants and shells, in the relationships between musical intervals. Leonardo illustrated Pacioli's book on the divine proportion, producing a series of beautiful drawings of three-dimensional geometric solids, and the collaboration seems to have deepened and enriched both men. Leonardo's own mathematical notebooks are full of geometric puzzles and experiments, attempts to square the circle, to find the proportional relationships between different areas and volumes, to understand the mathematics of perspective and the way that straight lines in the real world appear to converge at a distant point when viewed from a fixed position. He worked on problems of optics and mechanics that required significant mathematical sophistication, even if his approach was sometimes more intuitive than rigorous. And he had, throughout his life, a deep conviction that mathematics was the language in which the laws of nature were written, that the patterns he saw in water and in muscle and in the flight of birds were ultimately mathematical patterns, waiting for someone patient enough and perceptive enough to read them correctly. In the quietest and most personal sections of the notebooks, Leonardo writes about time. He writes about the passage of time in a way that is entirely consistent with the rest of his thinking, observationally, with curiosity, without self-deception, but also with a quality of feeling that is unmistakably present beneath the careful prose. He notes that every form in nature is always changing, always in the process of becoming something different from what it was. The river changes its course over centuries, wearing away one bank and depositing sediment on another. The mountain is slowly eroded by rain and frost and the roots of plants, its substance carried down to the sea in the form of silt. The human body grows and ages and finally dissolves back into the earth from which it came. Nothing stays still. Everything is in motion, even the things that appear most permanent. He was not, in the conventional sense, a religious man, though he was certainly not an atheist in any modern sense of the word. He believed in what he sometimes called nature, capitalized, as a kind of creative intelligence that manifested itself in the patterns and proportions and functional elegances of the natural world. When he dissected a body and found that the arrangement of the muscles perfectly served the purposes of the bones they moved, when he studied a bird's wing and found that every feather was exactly the right shape and size for its position in the overall structure, when he looked at a fossil shell and thought through the implications of its presence in a hillside far above the sea. In all these moments he felt, or seemed to feel, something like awe at the intelligence implicit in natural design. He wrote about this awe frequently, though usually obliquely, in passages that praise the divine craftsman who made things so efficiently and so beautifully. But he was also, and quite explicitly, a humanist, in the sense that he believed deeply in the power of human observation and human reason to understand the world. He distrusted authority, the authority of Aristotle, the authority of Galen, the authority of received tradition in any form. He believed that the only reliable way to know something was to look at it yourself, carefully and repeatedly, without preconceptions. He wrote, in a passage that is among the most often quoted from the notebooks, "Experience is never mistaken. Only your judgments are mistaken in expecting from her what is not in her power to give." This is a deeply empirical view of the world, a view that places observation above theory and the evidence of the senses above the testimony of authorities. And it was a view that made Leonardo, in some respects, 500 years ahead of his time. The notebooks contain sections on botany, and these are among the most peaceful and visually delightful of all the passages, because Leonardo's love of plants was genuine and deep, and expressed itself in a quality of attention that makes even a brief description of a leaf or a flower feel like a kind of gift. He was particularly interested in the way plants grow, in the mathematical patterns that govern the arrangement of leaves and branches, the way each new leaf on a stem is positioned at a specific angle from the one before it so as to maximize its exposure to light without being shaded by its neighbors. This pattern, now known as phyllotaxis, is one of the places where mathematics and natural beauty most obviously coincide, and Leonardo noticed it and described it and drew it with a clarity that shows how deeply he had looked at plants, how many hours he had spent in gardens and fields and beside streams, observing. He wrote about the growth rings of trees, the way each year of growth adds a new ring of wood, and the way you can read in the width of these rings the history of the tree's life, the good years and the bad, the years of plenty and the years of drought. He wrote about the way roots seek water, growing toward moisture in the soil with a persistence that looks, from the outside, almost purposeful. He wrote about the way leaves are constructed, the network of veins that carries water and nutrients to every cell of the leaf surface, the way the whole leaf is essentially a very efficient and very elegant solar panel, capturing light and using it to drive the chemistry of life. All of this is very pleasant to think about as you lie in the darkness, listening to whatever sounds are coming in from outside, the wind in trees, perhaps, or rain beginning to fall. The trees outside, if there are trees, are doing what trees have always done, growing their rings of wood and spreading their leaves toward whatever light is available, obeying the same mathematical patterns that Leonardo noticed in the gardens of Florence and Milan 5 centuries ago. The world is very old and very consistent, and the things that were worth noticing then are still worth noticing now, and will still be worth noticing long after the current tenants of the night have themselves dissolved back into the earth. Toward the end of the notebooks, or rather, toward what feels like the end when you read them in the collected edition, since there is no true end, no conclusion, only a gradual thinning out of material as Leonardo aged and his hand grew less steady. There are passages on what might be called the philosophy of painting, and these are in some ways the most interesting passages of all, because they reveal most clearly what Leonardo thought art was for and why it mattered. He believed that painting was superior to all other arts, and he argued this case at some length and with considerable spirit, deploying a wit and a polemical sharpness that is somewhat surprising in a man who is usually imagined as solitary and grave. He argued that painting was superior to sculpture because it required more intellectual subtlety. A sculptor works by removing material until the desired form is revealed, but a painter must create the illusion of three-dimensional form on a flat surface, using only light and color and the knowledge of how the eye reads them, and this is a harder and more impressive achievement. He argued that painting was superior to poetry because it could communicate directly and immediately across all language barriers to anyone who looked at it. A painted landscape was understood instantly by a person who had never seen that landscape, while a poem about the same landscape required a shared language and a shared set of cultural references. He argued that painting was superior to music because it lasted. A piece of music faded as soon as the last note died away, but a painting remained. These arguments are fun to read even if you don't entirely agree with them, because they show Leonardo as a man who was capable of taking a position and defending it, capable of intellectual combativeness and wit, capable of being genuinely interested in how different forms of human expression compared and contrasted. He was not simply a universal genius who excelled at everything with calm and effortless superiority. He had opinions, he had favorites, he thought some things were more important than other things, and he was willing to say so. But beneath the argument about the hierarchy of the arts, there is something more interesting, which is Leonardo's account of what painting actually does. He believed that the painter's job was to show the viewer things they had not noticed or had not seen clearly, to use the peculiar power of art, which can arrest time and hold a single moment still forever, to reveal the beauty and the interest and the significance of things that normally pass too quickly to be properly attended to. The moment when light hits a person's face in a particular way. The exact expression of a person lost in thought. The pattern of turbulence in water moving around a stone. These things happen and pass and are gone, and most people, most of the time, do not truly see them, because life moves too fast and attention is too limited. But the painter can stop time, can hold the moment, can force the eye to linger on what would otherwise be lost, and in doing so can give to the viewer a gift of seeing that they would not have had otherwise. This is, when you think about it quietly in the darkness, a very beautiful idea. And it is an idea that is perfectly consistent with everything else in the notebooks, with the water studies and the anatomical drawings and the geological observations and the botanical notes, because all of these are also, in a sense, acts of stopping time, acts of holding the moment still long enough to see it properly, acts of giving the eye and the mind the chance to notice what they would otherwise race past without comprehending. The war machines and the military engineering sections of the notebooks are perhaps the most uncomfortable to read, and yet they are important, because they remind you that Leonardo was not only a dreamer and an artist and a scientist, but also a professional, a man who needed to earn his living, and who lived in a world where the most reliable source of employment for a man of his talents was the service of princes and warlords who were almost continuously at war with each other. He designed a tank, a covered vehicle on wheels, armored against arrows and projectiles, driven by the force of men inside turning cranks, able to carry weapons and move across a battlefield. He designed artillery pieces and improved crossbows and various kinds of siege equipment. He designed bridges that could be built quickly by armies on the move and dismantled just as quickly when the army had crossed. He thought carefully and systematically about the mechanics of fortification and assault, about how walls should be built to resist cannon fire, about how trenches should be dug and how they could be defended. There is a passage in the notebooks where Leonardo lists the arguments he made to a prospective employer, Ludovico Sforza of Milan, for why he should be hired. Most of the list is military engineering. He can build bridges. He can drain moats. He can make artillery. He can design armored vehicles. Only at the end of the list does he mention, almost as an afterthought, that he can also paint and sculpt, and that in architecture he believes himself to be the equal of anyone. The priorities in this list reflect a practical reality. What princes paid for in the Italy of the late 15th century was primarily the ability to help them win wars, and Leonardo understood this and offered what the market required. But there are also passages in the notebooks where Leonardo writes about war itself, and these passages have a quality that is different from the technical matter of the engineering sections, a quality of revulsion and sadness that sits just beneath the surface of the careful prose. He calls war a bestial madness. He describes its effects on the human body and the human landscape with a specificity that suggests he had seen these effects firsthand. He was not, at heart, a man of war. He was a man of observation and understanding and beauty, who had been born into a world where violence was constant and unavoidable, and who managed this contradiction as best he could by serving the powerful, by producing the weapons they asked for, and by writing, in the privacy of his notebooks, what he actually thought about it. There are many lists in the notebooks. Leonardo loved lists. He made lists of things to do, lists of things to learn, lists of books he owned or wanted to obtain, lists of people he needed to talk to, lists of observations he had made and wanted to follow up on. Some of these lists are entirely mundane: expenses, quantities of materials, addresses of useful craftsmen. Others are strange and haunting because they record the breadth of a mind that was always reaching in too many directions at once, always finding new things to pursue before it had finished with the old ones. One of the most striking lists in the notebooks is a list of things Leonardo wanted to investigate. It includes the measurement of Milan and its suburbs, a method of saving oneself in a tempest at sea, how to find a vein of water in an arid country, the nature of the tongue of the woodpecker, the jaw of the crocodile, the tongue of a lamprey, the hand of a mole, the wings of a bat. Reading this list is a little like being inside Leonardo's mind for a moment, a mind that genuinely finds everything interesting, that experiences curiosity not as a burden or an obligation, but as a natural and continuous appetite, as easy and involuntary as breathing. The tongue of a woodpecker. This is a thing that you might have spent your whole life within 10 meters of if you have ever walked in a forest without ever thinking to wonder about it. Leonardo thought to wonder about it. He wanted to understand how the woodpecker's tongue worked, how it extended so far beyond the beak, how it navigated around corners in the crevices of bark, how it was anchored in the skull, how it managed to be both long enough to reach deep into a tree and precise enough to capture an insect at the far end. The tongue of a woodpecker. It is a small thing, one entry on a long list, and yet it is also a kind of portrait of an entire way of looking at the world, a way of looking that finds in every creature, every object, every phenomenon it encounters, something worth stopping for, something worth drawing and measuring and describing. Something that, when you look at it carefully enough, reveals itself as beautiful and intricate and worthy of the same serious attention that you might give to the greatest works of art or the deepest problems of philosophy. The moon appears in the notebooks, and so do the stars, and these are good things to think about as you prepare to sleep, because they have a quality of remoteness and permanence and scale that is very settling to the mind. Leonardo thought carefully about the moon and what it actually was. He disputed the widely held view that the moon was a smooth and perfect sphere, arguing from observation that the surface of the moon must be rough and irregular, like the surface of the earth, and that this roughness was responsible for the way the moon appeared, not as a perfectly uniform white disk, but as something more complex, with variations of light and shadow that suggested texture and depth. He was right about this, though it would be many decades before Galileo's telescope made the roughness of the lunar surface undeniable. He thought about why the moon shines. He understood that the moon does not produce its own light, but reflects the light of the sun, and he thought about this reflection in the same way he thought about all reflections, in terms of the angle of incidence and the nature of the reflecting surface. He noted that the full moon, seen from Earth, appears uniformly bright across its entire disk, while if the moon were a mirror-like sphere, it should appear brightest in the center and dimmer toward the edges. He reasoned from this that the lunar surface must scatter light in many directions rather than reflecting it in a single beam, which is again essentially correct. He also wrote about earthshine, the faint illumination of the dark part of the moon that is visible when the moon is a thin crescent. He understood that this was light from the sun being reflected by the earth onto the moon, and then reflected back to the earth's surface. He called it the moon's ashy glow, and he described it with a precision and clarity that shows how carefully he had looked at the night sky on those evenings when the new moon was just visible above the horizon, a thin silver arc with the whole dark face of the moon faintly visible behind it, lit by the borrowed light of the earth reflected in the borrowed light of the sun. There is something particularly beautiful about this passage, about the image of light bouncing between earth and moon and back again, each body illuminating the other with reflected radiance, the whole system turning slowly in space with the sun at the center, providing the energy that makes all the illumination possible. It is a peaceful image to carry with you into sleep, the earth and the moon turning together in the dark, exchanging their borrowed light, the whole thing very old and very calm, and very far above the noise and confusion of the world below. As you drift deeper now, let the pages of the notebooks become less distinct. Let the individual observations and drawings and calculations blur together gently into a single impression. The impression of a very large and very active mind slowly at work in the silence of a room at night. A candle burning, a pen moving from right to left across the page. Outside the window, the city of Florence or Milan or Rome quiet under the stars. And inside the room, this endless patient curiosity. This endless reaching toward understanding, this endless love of the particular feather, the particular wave, the particular muscle, the particular expression on a particular face, in a particular quality of afternoon light. Leonardo was not happy with abstraction. He was not interested in general principles for their own sake. He wanted to know how the thing actually worked, not how similar things worked in principle, not what the authorities said about it, but how this particular thing, right in front of him, actually functioned in the actual world. And the only way to know that was to look at it closely and patiently and without preconceptions, and then to look at it again, and then to draw it, and then to write down what the drawing had shown you, and then to look again to make sure the drawing and the description were both accurate. This is the method of the notebooks, and it is in some ways a very simple method. Look carefully, record honestly, look again. But the simplicity of the method only becomes apparent when you see how consistently and how rigorously Leonardo actually applied it. Over decades, across the entire range of his interests, never cutting corners, never settling for approximation when precision was available, never accepting someone else's account when he could verify it himself. The notebooks are, among other things, a sustained demonstration of what human attention, applied to the natural world with patience and love, can achieve in the span of a single life. Let all of this rest now in the background of your awareness, soft and warm and unhurried. The water moving around the stone, the wing of the bird adjusting to the changing pressure of the air, the rings of the tree recording the years of its life. The moon reflecting light that came from the sun and has bounced from the earth and traveled all this distance to arrive at your window. Very softly, very old. The same light that fell on Leonardo's notebooks 5 centuries ago as he wrote by candlelight about the tongue of a woodpecker or the bones of a hand or the spiral motion of water in a narrow channel or the slow and patient rising of the ancient seafloor into the mountains of Tuscany. Everything is connected. Everything is in motion. Everything is, when you look at it carefully enough, beautiful. These are the lessons of the notebooks, held very lightly now, like something cupped in both hands that you are about to set gently down. The pages turn themselves slower and slower. The pen moves right to left in the candlelight. Outside the window, the stars move westward through the night. And somewhere in the darkness, a woodpecker is sleeping in a hollow tree, its remarkable tongue folded away, waiting for morning, waiting to go again about its extraordinary and particular work in the world. Sleep now.